Hello, Saints. I'm in the book of Galatians today, and I'm looking at what Paul is saying to the Galatians regarding their acceptance with God. They keep wanting to do something themselves to commend themselves to God. You find yourself doing the same thing? He writes in chapter 2 of Galatians, there in verse 19, he says, "For through the law I died to the law so that I might live to God. I've been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. In the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me, gave himself up for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly." Do you get that? I do not nullify the grace of God. Why? What's the context he's saying there? For if righteousness, justice, comes by way of the law, then Christ died needlessly. You see, the Galatians he was writing to were moving away from the gospel of grace. He tells them there in chapter 3, he begins with, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified? This is the only thing I want to find out from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law, or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? Did you suffer so many things in vain, if indeed it was in vain? So then, does he who provides you with the Spirit and works miracles among you do it by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith?" You see, when we think about what we do, as if that commends ourselves to God, that somehow what we do will change God's mind about how he feels about us, what we're actually doing is nullifying God's grace. Now, it's not that he doesn't call us to obey, but that's not the pathway. Remember, Abraham obeyed God before he fell, and he could obey God, and this is how he would find his standing before God, his acceptance. But since the fall, we have been broken, and we cannot, through obedience, find our acceptance to God. Even if we could obey the law, by whatever power, from God or from us. Why? Because we've already broken the law. And because of that, we need another way. The law is not the way that we find acceptance with God. It is by faith in Christ Jesus. Paul emphasizes this back in chapter 2 of Galatians, verse 16. He writes it to make his point. In fact, he puts it in what's called an inverse parallel, where he says something one way and then he says it in reverse order the other way, in order to drive home the point that it is by faith, not by works. We read, "Nevertheless, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but through faith in Christ Jesus, even we have believed in Christ Jesus, so that we may be justified by faith in Christ, and not by the works of the law. Since by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified." Like I said, that ship has sailed. And so we need another way, and that way is in faith in what Christ has done for us. We see this back in the book of Romans there in chapter 3, where Paul speaks of Christ on the cross and what he had done on the cross. He says there that God showed himself just and the justifier of those who would have faith in what Jesus did. That's the point of salvation. God showed his justice for the law, and salvation to those who would have faith in what Jesus did on the cross. Will you believe him and not yourself? Will you take God at his word and simply say, "Yes, Lord"? What he has accomplished at the cross, he's done for us what we could not do for ourselves, and he simply says, "Come." Will you come? Blessings.